On a freezing January morning in 2025, the emergency board meeting at Titan Technologies convened with federal investigators lining the walls, attorneys filling every available seat, and a CEO who was about to discover that 6 years of telling people to sit down and be quiet had created the most comprehensive documentation of corporate fraud in Silicon Valley history. The room fell absolutely silent when 28-year-old Andre Williams, the company's senior legal analyst who'd started as a summer intern in 2019, connected his laptop to the massive projection screen and loaded a folder titled Comprehensive Documentation, Ethical Violations and Regulatory Risks, June 2019 to January 2025. 237 documents, 6 years of meticulous record-keeping, every email where Andre had flagged questionable accounting practices, every memo where he'd warned about labor law violations, every meeting recording where he'd raised concerns about SEC compliance issues, every dismissive response from CEO Richard Hendricks telling him to sit down, stop asking questions, focus on his actual job, remember his place in the organizational hierarchy. The Securities and Exchange Commission investigators already had copies of everything. So did the Department of Justice. And as the paper trail played chronologically on screen, starting with entry 1 from June 2019 and proceeding year by year through 237 documented violations, Richard Hendricks's expression evolved from confident to concerned to panicked to trapped. Because what Andre had documented wasn't just corporate negligence. It was systematic, willful fraud spanning 6 years. And the first 2 words Richard had ever spoken to Andre, sit down, were about to become the most expensive command he'd ever given. This is a story about what happens when arrogance meets persistence, when someone in power assumes that silencing questions makes problems disappear instead of just making consequences inevitable. When a CEO confuses authority with immunity and discovers that federal prosecutors don't care about organizational hierarchy. But more than that, it's a story about the power of one person who refused to let injustice hide in plain sight. About how documentation transforms from personal records into undeniable truth. About how the quietest resistance, the methodical building of evidence, can bring down the most powerful fraud. Andre Marcus Williams was born in Detroit, Michigan, in 1997, the son of parents who'd worked in automotive manufacturing until the plants closed. By the time Andre was 12, both his parents were working multiple low-wage service jobs trying to maintain the middle-class life they'd briefly achieved. But Andre had something that economic hardship couldn't diminish. He had a mind that saw patterns and systems combined with an intense sense of justice. In middle school, he documented racial disparities in school discipline with spreadsheets, presented it to the school board, and forced policy changes. In high school, he'd identified that the guidance counselor was steering black students away from AP classes, filed a complaint with documentation, and triggered an investigation that resulted in the counselor's removal. His teachers called him the prosecutor because he approached every injustice like a legal case, building evidence until the facts were undeniable. These weren't just childhood victories. They were Andre learning a fundamental truth that would define his entire career. Authority figures will dismiss your voice, but they cannot dismiss your documentation. Data doesn't care about hierarchy. Evidence doesn't respect seniority. And when you build a case methodically enough, comprehensively enough, persistently enough, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. He got into Princeton on a full scholarship, graduating in 2019 with a 3.9 GPA and acceptance to Yale Law School, deferred for 2 years so he could gain work experience first. That summer, Titan Technologies offered him an internship in their legal and compliance department. $25 an hour, potential pathway to full-time employment. Titan Technologies had been founded in 2014 by Richard Hendricks, who'd raised $80 million in venture funding to build enterprise software for data analytics. By 2019, Titan had grown to 800 employees, 300 million in annual revenue, and a reputation as one of Silicon Valley's fastest-growing companies. Richard was the prototypical tech CEO, confident to the point of arrogance, convinced that rules applying to other companies didn't apply to innovators like Titan. Richard had built Titan on a specific philosophy: move fast, break things, apologize later if necessary, but preferably never. He believed compliance departments existed to provide legal cover, not to actually constrain business decisions. This philosophy had worked during Titan's growth phase, when they were too small for regulatory scrutiny. What Richard didn't understand was that move fast and break things works fine when you're breaking conventions and disrupting markets. It becomes criminal when you're breaking laws and defrauding investors. The line between aggressive innovation and fraud isn't determined by your vision or confidence. It's determined by regulations written specifically to prevent the kind of corner-cutting that Richard had elevated to corporate philosophy. When 22-year-old Andre Williams walked into Titan's San Francisco headquarters in June 2019, he was assigned basic paralegal work: review contracts, research regulatory requirements, assist with compliance documentation. But Andre approached everything with meticulous attention to detail. He didn't just review contracts. He analyzed them for potential regulatory risks. Within 3 weeks, he'd identified something that made his stomach turn. Titan's revenue recognition practices were aggressive to the point of being fraudulent. They were booking revenue from multi-year contracts in the quarter when contracts were signed, rather than recognizing it over the contract term as services were delivered. This violated generally accepted accounting principles and SEC regulations, creating financial statements that materially misrepresented the company's actual performance. Andre spent a week documenting the pattern, calculating that approximately $43 million in reported revenue over the past 4 quarters shouldn't have been recognized yet. He compiled everything into a detailed memo with regulatory citations and recommended that Titan restate its earnings. On June 28, 2019, Andre was summoned to the executive conference room to present his findings to the CEO and senior leadership team. 12 executives around a mahogany table. Richard Hendricks at the head. Andre was 22 years old, 3 weeks into his first corporate internship, about to tell a billionaire CEO that his company's financial reporting was fraudulent. Andre presented his analysis methodically, showed the contracts, cited the specific GAAP principles and SEC regulations being violated, recommended immediate remediation. When he finished, Richard Hendricks smiled. Not a warm smile. The smile of someone about to destroy an insect. Let me make sure I understand. You've been here for 3 weeks. You're a summer intern. And you're telling me that our CFO, who has an MBA from Wharton and 20 years of experience in financial reporting, is committing accounting fraud? I'm not saying it's fraud, sir. I'm saying the revenue recognition timing doesn't comply with... Sit down, intern. Richard's voice was sharp. You've read some textbook rules about revenue recognition, and you think that makes you smarter than experienced executives who've been building companies since before you were born. What you don't understand is that GAAP principles have flexibility. Our practices are aggressive but not illegal. Our auditors have signed off on everything. Andre remained standing. Sir, with respect, the SEC regulations I cited don't have flexibility on this point. Revenue recognition is tied to delivery milestones. Sit down. Richard's voice was ice. You're an intern. Your job is to learn, not to lecture executives about how to run a company. Sarah, please ensure your team understands the difference between raising good faith questions and wasting senior leadership's time with unfounded accusations of fraud. In that moment, Richard Hendricks made a fatal miscalculation. He confused Andre's youth with ignorance. He confused his own authority with correctness. He assumed that dismissing the question would make the problem disappear. What he didn't see was that Andre wasn't just raising a concern. He was testing whether Titan's leadership would listen to truth regardless of who spoke it. And Richard had just failed that test in a way that would be documented, preserved, and eventually played in federal court as evidence of willful fraud. Andre sat down, but as he gathered his materials, he activated the voice recording app on his phone that he'd started running before the meeting began. He captured every word of Richard's dismissal. That evening, Andre created a new folder in his secure personal cloud storage. Titan Documentation Project, June 2019, ongoing. The first entry was his revenue recognition memo, the supporting documentation, and the audio recording of Richard telling him to sit down. Entry number 1, revenue recognition violations identified, CEO dismissed concerns as intern overreach, violations continue. Date, June 28, 2019. Status, unresolved. Predicted outcome, SEC scrutiny if practices continue. At summer's end, Titan offered Andre a full-time position, legal analyst, $65,000 per year. Andre accepted. If Richard Hendricks was going to commit fraud while silencing anyone who pointed it out, someone needed to document everything that happened next. And here's what makes Andre's decision extraordinary. He wasn't motivated by revenge. He wasn't driven by ego. He was driven by something deeper, a fundamental belief that companies shouldn't be able to break laws just because they have charismatic leaders and expensive lawyers. He understood that the only way to fight systematic fraud wasn't through confrontation or escalation. It was through comprehensive, undeniable documentation that would speak for itself when the moment of accountability finally arrived. Over the next 6 years, Andre became Titan's most diligent legal analyst, while simultaneously becoming Richard Hendricks's most ignored conscience. Each violation followed a depressingly predictable pattern. Andre's warning, Richard's dismissal, the inevitable consequence. Entry number 12, September 2019. Andre identified that Titan was misclassifying software engineers as exempt employees to avoid paying overtime. He documented 73 engineers working 50 to 60-hour weeks without overtime compensation, calculated the wage theft at approximately $1.6 million annually. Richard's email response, "Our compensation structure is competitive and has been reviewed by counsel. Engineers are salaried professionals who understand startup culture. Tell Andre to focus on actual legal risks, not theoretical wage and hour issues." In March 2023, 3 former engineers filed a class action lawsuit citing the exact violations Andre had documented 4 years earlier. The settlement was $8.4 million plus mandatory reclassification of 97 employees and back pay for overtime. Entry number 29, March 2020. Andre discovered that Titan was using aggressive tax avoidance strategies that crossed into tax evasion. They'd created shell companies in Ireland and the Cayman Islands with fabricated business justifications and false documentation. Andre spent 3 weeks documenting the shell company structure. His memo to Sarah Martinez was urgent. This structure lacks economic substance and appears designed solely for tax avoidance. The service agreements with the offshore entities are not supported by actual services rendered. This creates significant IRS fraud exposure and potential criminal liability. Richard's response: "Our tax strategy was designed by a Big Four accounting firm and saves us millions annually. Andre clearly doesn't understand sophisticated tax planning." The IRS audit notification came in September 2024, 4 years and 6 months after Andre's warning. They assessed that Titan owed back taxes plus penalties totaling $37 million and referred the matter to IRS criminal investigation. Entry number 47, August 2020. Titan was preparing to go public. Andre reviewed the S1 registration statement and found multiple material omissions. Customer churn rates were significantly understated. 12% reported when actual was 27%. Revenue concentration with top customers wasn't properly disclosed, 63% from just 5 customers. Andre compiled a 30-page memo documenting each misstatement with supporting evidence. Richard's email: the S1 was prepared by experienced securities counsel. Andre is a junior analyst who's never been through an IPO and doesn't understand that disclosure is about presenting information in the most favorable light possible. The S1 went forward with the misrepresentations intact. Titan's IPO in October 2020 raised $400 million. Richard became a billionaire on paper. Then in April 2022, 2 of Titan's 5 major customers ended their contracts. The stock price dropped 41% in one day as investors realized how dependent Titan was on a few customers. Entry number 78, January 2021. Andre identified that Titan was recognizing revenue from a government contract before meeting required security compliance. They'd signed a $12 million deal with a federal agency, recognized the full revenue, but hadn't completed the security certifications required to deliver the service. Richard's email response: the contract is signed, the customer is happy, we'll complete the security stuff in a few months. This is how enterprise deals work. The security certifications were never completed. The agency discovered the issue, canceled the contract, demanded repayment, and referred the matter to the Department of Justice. Titan settled for $24 million to avoid criminal prosecution. Pattern after pattern, year after year. Andre would identify violations, cite specific regulations, predict consequences. Richard would dismiss the concerns. Then the predicted consequences would materialize, costing Titan millions. What's crucial to understand is that each of these violations wasn't isolated. They were part of a corporate culture where compliance was treated as obstacle rather than obligation, where legal warnings were dismissed as a lack of business understanding, where the person raising concerns was always wrong until the lawsuit proved them right. And Andre documented all of it, not just the violations, but the dismissals, the condescension, the pattern of willful ignorance that transformed mistakes into crimes. By early 2025, Andre's documentation folder contained 237 entries spanning 6 years. Revenue recognition fraud, tax evasion, securities fraud, false claims, wage theft, environmental violations, data privacy breaches. Andre had also gotten his law degree from Yale while working at Titan full-time, graduating in 2023. He'd passed the California bar exam. He was now a licensed attorney with expertise in corporate law and securities regulation. In November 2024, when Andre identified that Titan was materially misstating its financial results in ways that made previous violations look minor, he made a decision. He filed a whistleblower complaint with the SEC and DOJ, providing comprehensive documentation of 6 years of fraud. On January 9, 2025, SEC. Investigators arrived at Titan's offices with subpoenas for 6 years of financial records. The board convened an emergency meeting. Richard prepared to present his defense: good faith business decisions, honest mistakes, reliance on qualified professionals. What Richard didn't know was that the board had requested Andre's presence. The SEC had shared portions of the whistleblower documentation with Titan's board. The emergency board meeting convened on January 14, 2025. 11 board members, SEC investigators along the wall, crisis management attorneys filling remaining seats. The company's stock had dropped 43% since the investigation was announced. Board Chairman Michael Foster interrupted Richard's prepared remarks. Before you continue, Richard, I want Andre Williams to present the documentation he's been keeping since 2019. Andre is the whistleblower who triggered this investigation. He's documented 6 years of warnings about the exact issues SEC is now investigating. Warnings you dismissed. Andre, please proceed. Andre connected his laptop. The first slide appeared. Comprehensive documentation, ethical violations and regulatory risks, June 2019 to January 2025. Total documented entries 237. On June 28, 2019, 3 weeks into my internship, I identified revenue recognition practices that violated GAAP and SEC regulations. I presented my findings to CEO Richard Hendricks. He told me to sit down, said I was overstepping my role. That was entry number 1. He pulled up the audio recording. Richard's voice filled the boardroom. Sit down, intern. You're wasting senior leadership's time with unfounded accusations of fraud. Andre displayed his original memo with revenue recognition analysis. This is what I identified in June 2019. $43 million in improperly recognized revenue. Here's the SEC regulation being violated. Here's Richard's dismissal. And here's the consequence. The revenue recognition issues are now central to the SEC investigation into securities fraud. For 90 minutes, Andre walked the board through 6 years of documented violations. Each entry showed the pattern. Andre's warning with regulatory citations, Richard's dismissal with condescending language, and the eventual outcome proving Andre had been exactly right. The entries played chronologically. 2019. Revenue recognition fraud identified, dismissed, confirmed. Tax evasion structure identified, dismissed, confirmed. 2020. IPO disclosure violations identified, dismissed, confirmed via shareholder litigation. 2021. False Claims Act, violations identified, dismissed, confirmed via DOJ investigation. Each year, more violations, each warning more urgent, each dismissal more arrogant, each consequence more expensive. The board members' expressions evolved from attentive to shocked to horrified as the pattern became undeniable. This wasn't about complicated business decisions. This was about systematic fraud perpetrated by a CEO who'd been repeatedly warned. What destroyed Richard completely was entry number 237 from December 2024. Andre displayed his final internal warning before filing the whistleblower complaint. He'd identified that Titan was materially overstating its user growth metrics in SEC filings, fabricated numbers inflated by counting inactive accounts, and bot activity. Richard's email response, dated December 3, 2024, appeared on screen. Sarah, we've been through this with Andre for 6 years. He's technically competent, but fundamentally doesn't understand how public companies manage investor expectations. Tell Andre to sit down and focus on contract review. If he can't operate within appropriate boundaries, we need to discuss whether he's still a good fit for this team. That email, sent 41 days before the SEC investigation began, was a threat. Documentation that Richard knew Andre was raising concerns about securities fraud and responded by threatening his employment. One of the SEC investigators, Maria Gonzalez, spoke. Mr. Hendricks, Mr. Williams identified material misstatements in your revenue recognition in June 2019. Your response was to tell him to sit down and remember his place? Richard spoke despite his lawyer's warning. I was running a company. I couldn't stop operations every time a junior analyst raised theoretical compliance concerns. These weren't theoretical. Entry number 1 identified $43 million in improperly recognized revenue. Your company just restated earnings, reversing $217 million in improperly recognized revenue. That's fraud. She looked at the board. We've reviewed all 237 entries. Each one shows clear identification of legal violations, dismissal by Mr. Hendricks, and each one proved correct. This isn't complex business judgments. This is willful fraud perpetrated despite repeated warnings from qualified legal counsel. Board member Jennifer Morrison found her voice. Richard, you told Andre to sit down 237 times over 6 years. Every single time he was right and you were wrong. The cumulative cost is $340 million in SEC fines, settlements, restatements, and legal fees, plus potential criminal liability. Michael Foster looked at Richard with disgust. You built a fraud on top of a fraud, and every time someone tried to stop you, you told them to sit down. Well, Richard, you're the one who's going to sit down now, in federal prison. The board voted unanimously to terminate Richard Hendricks as CEO effective immediately. The SEC fined Titan $340 million for securities fraud, accounting violations, and material misstatements. The DOJ filed criminal charges against Richard Hendricks for securities fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to federal agencies. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Andre's documentation was the prosecution's primary evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on 17 of 19 counts. Richard Hendricks was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $63 million in restitution and fines. Andre Williams was offered Titan's general counsel position and a seat on the board. He accepted with conditions: comprehensive ethics reforms, mandatory whistleblower protections, and requirements that legal concerns raised by any employee receive formal written response from leadership rather than dismissal. 5 years later, Andre Williams stands in front of a law school class teaching corporate governance. He talks about being 22 and being told to sit down by a billionaire, about spending 6 years watching fraud continue while documenting everything. The day Richard Hendricks told me to sit down, Andre tells his students, he thought he'd won. He'd put the intern in his place. He'd protected his fraud from scrutiny. And for 6 years, it looked like he was right. The company grew. The stock price rose. But here's what he didn't understand. When you tell someone to sit down and stop asking questions about your crimes, you're not making the crimes disappear. You're creating documentation of willful intent when those crimes eventually get discovered. Every time he told me to sit down, he was making his eventual prosecution easier because I was documenting everything. That's the lesson. Fraud always gets discovered eventually. The only question is whether you'll be able to claim it was an honest mistake or whether someone will have 6 years of documentation proving you knew exactly what you were doing and chose to do it anyway. Andre pauses, looking at each student. Here's what I want you to understand. Documentation isn't just about building evidence. It's about creating accountability in systems designed to avoid it. Richard Hendricks operated in an environment where his authority protected him from consequences, where his confidence was mistaken for competence, where telling someone to sit down was considered leadership rather than suppression. But documentation changes the power dynamic. It doesn't matter if you're a summer intern or a CEO. It doesn't matter if you're 22 or 62. What matters is whether you can prove what happened, whether you can show the pattern, whether you can demonstrate that warnings were given and deliberately ignored. The 237 entries in my database weren't just records. They were proof that Titan's failures weren't accidents. They were choices. And that distinction between mistake and choice, between error and fraud, is what determines whether someone gets fired or goes to prison. Andre Williams didn't become a billionaire. He became something more important. He became proof that persistent documentation defeats powerful fraud when the documentation is thorough enough and the patience is strong enough. Because here's what Richard Hendricks learned in federal prison. The words, "sit down," are only effective if the person you're speaking to actually stops. Andre Williams sat down, but he never stopped watching, never stopped documenting. never stopped building the case that would eventually prove Richard had committed systematic fraud while silencing the one person trying to stop him. So ask yourself, whose warnings are you dismissing? Whose concerns are you silencing because they're too junior or don't understand business reality? Whose documentation of your decisions might someday become evidence? They might be sitting down like you told them to, but they might also be keeping records, building files, documenting every time you chose fraud over compliance. And one day, they might present 6 years of comprehensive documentation that sends you to federal prison. Choose differently. Choose to listen to legal warnings regardless of who raises them. Choose to address concerns rather than silence the people raising them. Choose compliance over fraud before someone documents years of your choices. Choose to understand that sit down doesn't make problems disappear. It just makes consequences inevitable when the person who sat down was actually keeping records the entire time. Because in the end, the most dangerous words in corporate America aren't, "I'm calling the lawyers," or "I'm going to the SEC." The most dangerous words are the quiet ones. Entry number 1. Date, June 28, 2019. Status, documented. This story is a fictionalized account inspired by real corporate fraud cases and the critical role of persistent whistleblowers in exposing wrongdoing. In a business world that often rewards aggressive risk-taking over ethical caution, choose to be the leader who listens to warnings before they become criminal evidence.